Hello, and welcome to the U.S. General Services Administration's public hearing on the draft environmental impact statement for the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's master plan for the Muirkirk Road campus, commonly referred to as the MRC. The MRC is located in Laurel, Maryland, at the corner of Muirkirk and Odell Roads. My name is Marshall Popkin, and I am the NEPA specialist for GSA for this master plan. With me is Liz Estes from Stantec Consulting Services, our environmental consultant. In carrying out our environmental and socioeconomic analysis responsibilities, GSA is committed to ensuring we provide proper consideration to the quality of the natural and human environment. This hearing is an important opportunity for you to provide your comments on the draft EIS for the MRC Master Plan. We appreciate your participation. Before inviting the public to provide comments, we want to provide you some background information on the project. We will describe the processes for complying with the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, commonly referred to as NEPA, and Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. We will explain the proposed action and its purpose and need. We will then give a brief overview of the proposed alternatives, and finally, we will provide an overview of the potential environmental, cultural, and socioeconomic impacts from these alternatives. At the conclusion of our presentation, we will review how you can provide comments on the draft EIS. GSA, in cooperation with FDA, is preparing a master plan to guide further development for FDA at the MRC. Regulatory compliance for the master plan, NEPA, and Section 106 processes is occurring concurrently. GSA first solicited comments from the public during a scoping period which occurred this past January. Throughout the development of the master plan, GSA and FDA have involved the public and federal, state, and local agencies to seek input on the master plan. GSA and FDA have also held 2 consulting party meetings to provide information on cultural resources and possible impacts to them, and to provide recommendations regarding cultural resources. In addition, the draft master plan and a draft transportation management plan have been submitted to the National Capital Planning Commission and other local and regional agencies for their review and comment. GSA, with input from FDA as a cooperating agency, has prepared a draft EIS in accordance with the requirements of NEPA. NEPA is the nation's legislative charter for protection of the environment and provides for the consideration of environmental issues in federal agency planning and decision-making. NEPA requires GSA to prepare an EIS when a proposed action may significantly impact the quality of the natural and human environment. An EIS informs federal decision makers and the public about the potential environmental impacts of implementing the alternatives for the proposed action, including the no action alternative. We are now on step 4 of our NEPA process. The draft EIS was issued to the public and to regulatory agencies for public comment on June 4, 2021. The 45-day public comment period will end on July 19, 2021. The NEPA process began when GSA published a notice of intent to prepare an EIS in the Federal Register on December 22, 2020. Since then, GSA, with input from FDA as a cooperating agency, has collected and analyzed data and continued consultation with stakeholders and other government agencies in order to develop the draft EIS. In 2022, GSA plans to release the final EIS to the public for a review period of 30 days before making a final decision, at which point GSA will publish a record of decision. A record of decision is a public document that contains a statement of the decision made among the alternatives considered and the applicable monitoring and enforcement plan for all mitigations adopted for the project. Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 requires that federal agencies consider the effects of their actions on any district, site, building, structure, or object listed in or eligible for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places. Section 106 review ensures that preservation values are factored into federal agency planning and decisions. Concurrent with the NEPA process, GSA has initiated consultation under Section 106. Section 106 also requires that GSA provide the public, agencies, and other interested parties the opportunity to comment on GSA actions impacting historic resources. GSA is currently consulting with the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the Maryland State Historic Preservation Office, known as the Maryland Historical Trust, and other consulting parties. GSA, along with the Advisory Council, Maryland Historical Trust, and other consulting parties, have determined that the master plan would have no adverse effects on cultural resources. GSA is integrating the public involvement processes for Section 106 and NEPA. Though comments on the draft EIS are due by July 19th, comments on the Section 106 process will be accepted throughout GSA's consultation with the Maryland Historical Trust. Within the regulatory framework described in the last few slides, GSA is proposing to implement a master plan to accommodate future growth and further consolidate FDA operations at the MRC in Laurel, Maryland. The master plan would provide a framework for development to accommodate up to 1,800 FDA employees and support staff over the next 20 years. 900 employee parking spaces would be provided at a ratio of 1 space for every 2 employees. The purpose of the proposed action is to provide a master plan for FDA's Muirkirk Road campus to guide future development on the site. The master plan would provide a framework for development at the MRC to accommodate projected growth to support FDA's consolidation. The master plan would also steer the planning, design, and construction of new buildings, improvements to roadways, utilities, and other infrastructure, and the protection of natural areas. In 1964, FDA acquired 197 acres on the northern boundary of the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, or BARC, through a transfer of land from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or USDA. FDA prepared a site development plan to establish the MRC on the property, which was approved by NCPC on July 21, 1966. The 1966 plan called for the construction of laboratories, kennels, and a research farm with 700,000 gross square feet of building space, 1,060 to 1,260 parking spaces, and 1,480 to 1,800 employees. Due to funding issues, only a small portion of the planned laboratories were built. These included the Beltsville Research Facility, or BRF, Special Pharmacological Animal Laboratory Complex, BRF service buildings, kennels, and several ancillary utility buildings. The kennels were removed from the BRF in the early 2000s. Between 1972 and 1973, FDA began a site selection process for its headquarters laboratories, looking at 26 potential locations within a 50-mile radius of Washington, D.C. In 1973, 4 of these sites were evaluated in some detail. These 4 sites were the MRC and land in Columbia, Maryland, Southeast Washington, D.C., and Reston, Virginia. After NEPA regulations were finalized in 1978, each of these sites was reevaluated in 1979 based upon site selection practices, which analyzed land use, natural ecology, water and air quality, noise, social, economic, and transportation impacts, and aesthetics. In 1981, FDA proposed a phased development program for new facilities. When complete, the proposed phased development would have consolidated FDA activities at 4 facilities in Washington, D.C. metro area and other sites in St. Louis, Missouri, and Cincinnati, Ohio. As a result of this proposal, FDA prepared an EIS in 1981 to assess construction on the MRC. Upon completion of the 1981 EIS, the Mod 1 and Mod 2 buildings were constructed in phases from 1983 to 1996 on the northwestern portion of the MRC. The animal research facility was constructed on the southwest portion of the MRC in the late 1990s. GSA and our project team have studied the no-action alternative and 3 action alternatives. Under the no-action alternative, a new MRC master plan would not be adopted, and FDA would continue its current operations at the MRC. The site would continue to be occupied by the Center for Veterinary Medicine and Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition support staff. No new office or special use facilities would be constructed, and the number of employees and support staff would remain at 300. And there would continue to be 320 surface parking spaces for employees, support staff, and visitors. There is currently 480,000 gross square feet of office and laboratory space and 32 acres of pastures. FDA would continue to operate at several locations within the region to accommodate its employees and support staff to continue to fulfill its mission. Any additional FDA employees would need to be housed in other government-owned or leased space in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. The housing of employees outside the MRC would continue to result in inefficiencies in coordination of work products and in use of administrative, management, and technical support functions. The no-action alternative also includes ongoing maintenance projects. The 3 action alternatives propose the new development on the northeastern portion of the campus around the existing Mod 1 and Mod 2 buildings, referred to as the Mod 1, Mod 2 site, and or the existing Beltsville Research Facility, referred to as the BRF site. With each of the action alternatives, the number of FDA employees and support staff at the MRC would increase to approximately 1,800 over the next 20 years in 2 phases. Each alternative proposes the addition of an approximate total 438,000 gross square feet of new building area, which breaks down to 375,000 gross square feet of office space and 63,000 gross square feet of special use spaces. The special use spaces include a conference center, cafeteria, fitness center, and truck screening facility. The new building increases the campus's built-up area to 918,000 gross square feet. To accommodate the proposed growth, 900 parking spaces are proposed for employees and support staff and 80 spaces for visitors. New parking spaces would, in part, replace existing surface parking spaces that would be displaced by the new buildings. The final parking would equate to a parking ratio of 1 parking space for every 2 employees. This parking ratio would limit the number of vehicles traveling to the site. With Alternative A, most of the new development would be concentrated on the Mod 1, Mod 2 site, with the exception of the parking garages. The garages would be located on the BRF site. The new building north of Mod 1 would be visible from the main entrance at Muirkirk Road, but most of the remaining building volume would be screened by forested areas that form the perimeter landscape buffer. A strategically positioned atrium would allow for a view from the main entry through the new building into the forested stream valley at the center of the campus. Alternative A would include 2 new office buildings would be placed to the north and west of the existing Mod 1 and Mod 2 buildings. These building heights would stay within the range of the existing Mod 1 building. 2 pedestrian sky bridges would connect Mod 1 to the new buildings to the north and west. The existing parking lot west of Mod 1 would be replaced with a new building. 2 new parking garages would be located at the BRF site that would contain 900 parking spaces. 80 surface parking spaces would be provided for visitors, and an elevated boardwalk would be constructed within the natural landscape east of the Mod 1 and Mod 2 buildings. With Alternative B, the new development would be distributed between the Mod 1, Mod 2 site and the BRF site. As with Alternative A, a strategically positioned atrium would allow for a view from the main entry through the new building into the forested stream valley at the center of the campus. Again, most of the remaining building volume would be screened by forested areas that form the perimeter landscape buffer. Alternative B would include 2 new buildings which would be placed northeast of Mod 1 that would be connected by a sky bridge, and a third, smaller building would be constructed to the south of Mod 2. An additional sky bridge would connect the new building to the Mod 1 building. The new building heights would stay within the range of the existing Mod 1 building. 1 parking garage would be constructed to replace the existing surface parking lot west of the Mod 1 and Mod 2 buildings. The second parking garage would be constructed at the BRF site. These garages would be up to 3 stories tall and provide 900 total parking spaces for employees and support staff. 80 surface parking spaces would also be provided for visitors. An elevated boardwalk would be constructed within the natural landscape east of the Mod 1 building. With alternative C, the new development primarily would be concentrated on the BRF site. The new buildings would barely be visible from the main entrance at Muirkirk Road, as most of the building volume would be screened by forested areas that form the perimeter landscape buffer. The forested stream valley at the center of the campus would be visible. With alternative C, 2 new office buildings would be constructed at the BRF. These 2 buildings would be connected by a sky bridge and would be up to 5 stories tall, which would be higher than the existing 1-story buildings currently at the BRF site. The existing BRF building would be retained for a security screening area. 2 new parking garages, up to 3 stories tall, would be constructed to the east of the new building, providing a total of 750 parking spaces. A total of 230 surface parking spaces would also be provided, 80 new visitor parking spaces on the BRF site, and 150 existing parking spaces on the Mod 1, Mod 2 site. Currently, there are 283 parking spaces adjacent to the Mod 1 and Mod 2 buildings, which would be returned to natural landscape. That parking lot would be reduced from 283 parking spaces to 150 parking spaces. An elevated boardwalk would be constructed within the natural landscape amenity space east of the Mod 1 and Mod 2 buildings. I'm now going to turn the presentation over to our environmental consultant, Liz Estes, who will go over the impacts of the master plan.
Thank you, Marshall. Each of the alternatives studied in the draft EIS would result in impacts to the human environment. There would be impacts to the natural environment, the socioeconomic environment surrounding the campus, to viewsheds, and to traffic. But before we moved into discussing impacts, we want to explain how impacts are assessed for each action alternative. The impacts for each of the alternatives are assessed by comparing conditions under each alternative to the conditions under the no action alternative, which is used as a baseline. The draft EIS characterizes impacts based on their level of intensity, type, duration, and context. Intensity refers to the severity of the impact. The MRC draft EIS uses 4 intensity thresholds: negligible, minor, moderate, and major. Major impacts are those considered significant under NEPA regulations. A finding of significance allows decision makers to focus mitigations and make an informed decision. Adverse impacts that are measurable but not major are either negligible, where the impact is localized and not measurable at the lowest level of detection, minor, where the impact is localized and slight but detectable, and moderate, where the impact is readily apparent and there would be noticeable change from current conditions. The type of impact describes the beneficial or adverse nature of the impact, and the duration of the impact considers how long impacts are expected to last. Short-term impacts are defined as those associated with the construction period or those lasting less than 1 year, while long-term impacts are defined as those occurring beyond 1 year from construction. The draft EIS also evaluates impacts at the site-specific, local, and regional level as appropriate for each resource topic. To assess the potential environmental impacts under each alternative, We collected and analyzed information on a wide range of resource categories, which will be the focus of the remainder of tonight's discussion. It has been determined that the proposed master plan would have negligible to no impact on geology, floodplains, coastal zone management, protected species, population and housing, community facilities and services, safety and security, and cultural resources. We will first look at natural resources. Natural resources that were studied in detail in the draft EIS include soils and topography, groundwater, surface water and wetlands, stormwater, vegetation, and wildlife. The no-action alternative would not result in construction of new buildings, but soils would be disturbed by drainage improvements along the North Loop Road. Therefore, a negligible short-term adverse impact to soils would result. There would be no long-term impact. Alternatives A, B, and C would each result in moderate short-term adverse impacts from the clearing, grading, and excavation of soils. With alternative A, 22.7 acres of soils would be excavated for new building areas as compared to 22.5 acres for alternative B and 20.2 acres for alternative C. Alternative A would disturb the most steep slopes at 1.5 acres, while alternative B would impact 1.4 acres of steep slopes, and alternative C would impact the least with 1.2 acres. Demolition of existing buildings and roadways would impact 7.8 acres of soils under alternative A. Alternatives B and C would impact 7.4 and 5.2 acres of soils respectively. All of the action alternatives would result in moderate long-term adverse impacts from potential soil erosion and slope failure. Under the no-action alternative, no significant impacts to groundwater would occur. Groundwater intrusion into the Mod 1 building would continue and be managed by a sump system. Demolition of buildings under alternatives A, B, and C would not directly impact groundwater. Construction of the proposed office buildings and parking garages could intercept the groundwater table from construction of underground portions of the buildings, resulting in minor short-term adverse impacts. There would be the potential for groundwater intrusion into the underground areas of the buildings, which could affect building operations. With each of the alternatives, there would be an increase in impervious surface, which would be the greatest under alternative B. The net increase in impervious surfaces under alternatives A, B, and C is 2.8, 5.6, and 4.0 acres respectively. Overall, the impacts would be minor, long-term, and adverse. Surface waters or wetlands would not be impacted under the no-action alternative. During construction, alternatives A and C would result in moderate short-term adverse impacts to wetlands, while alternative B would impact less wetlands, resulting in a minor short-term adverse impact. Alternative A would result in 246 linear feet of stream impacts and 0.05 acres of permanent wetland and wetland buffer impacts, which would have a moderate long-term adverse impact to streams, wetlands, and wetland buffers. Alternative B would not impact streams, but result in 0.03 acres of wetlands and 0.01 acres of wetland buffer impacts, resulting in negligible long-term adverse impacts. Alternative C would result in 68 linear feet of stream impacts, 0.05 acres of wetlands, and 0.04 acres of impacts to wetland buffers. These impacts would be minor, long-term, and adverse. Stormwater runoff would be minimized with drainage improvements that would occur under the no-action alternative. Under the action alternatives, there would be adverse impacts due to increased runoff from an increase in impervious areas from proposed buildings, roads, and parking structures. Under each of the action alternatives, the adverse impacts from an increase in stormwater runoff would be minor and long-term. There would be minor short-term adverse impacts during construction. Alternative A would require the clearing of 4.8 acres of forest. There would be 5.2 acres of forest removed under alternative B and 4.8 acres under alternative C. In addition, approximately 3.5 acres of maintained lawn would be removed under alternatives A and B, and 4.1 acres under alternative C. There would also be up to 0.2 acres of impacts to primary management areas. The long-term impact of vegetation would be negligible to moderate and adverse. These impacts would occur in the interior of the MRC, and no perimeter vegetation is expected to be removed. After construction is complete, disturbed areas would be revegetated, and any trees removed would be replaced according to NCPC, State of Maryland, and Prince George's County requirements. During construction, clearing, grading, and road and building debris may result in moderate short-term adverse impacts to vegetation due to the clearing needed for construction and the preparation of temporary staging and laydown areas. The impacts would be minimized using best management practices. The forested portions of the study area provide the majority of the habitat for terrestrial wildlife. These areas would not be impacted under the no action alternative. As with impacts to vegetation, the removal of forest would result in a loss of habitat for terrestrial wildlife and migratory birds within the study area. However, no particular species which is currently utilizing the site is likely to be eliminated as a result of any of the action alternatives. Increased impervious surface area would increase runoff into the stream between Mods 1 and 2 and the BRF, which could impact habitat for aquatic wildlife. In addition, potential erosion and sedimentation from construction would also add to the degradation of the aquatic habitat. Therefore, all action alternatives would result in minor, short-term, and long-term adverse impacts to wildlife. Socioeconomic topics that were analyzed in further detail in the draft EIS include viewsheds, land use planning and zoning, economy and employment, and environmental justice. Alternatives A and B would change viewsheds to and from the MRC, which would result in minor long-term adverse impacts. Alternative C, on the other hand, would not discernibly change the viewshed to and from the MRC, resulting in negligible long-term adverse impacts. In all alternatives, new buildings would be seen from the main entrance, but building volume would be screened by the forested areas surrounding the site. There would be no changes in viewshed under the no action alternative. The master plan would encourage efficiency, higher productivity, and collaboration that is consistent with the federal elements of NCPC's comprehensive plan for the national capital. A transportation management plan has also been developed that encourages alternative means of transportation, which is consistent with the transportation element of the comprehensive plan. And buildings would be constructed and operated in an energy efficient manner, which is consistent with the environmental element. The action alternatives would also be consistent with the goals of Prince George's County's Subregion 1 plan, which calls for green design, sustainable development, and attracting new employment opportunities. Land use within the project area would not change under the no action alternative, and there would be negligible long-term impacts from not fully meeting the goals of NCPC's comprehensive master plan. The no action alternative would not see an increase in population of employees at the MRC. The need for additional employees would result in a minor long-term adverse impact. All of the action alternatives would see an increase in employees at the MRC. Local retail and business may employ additional labor to meet the demand of the increased FDA workforce. Therefore, the action alternatives would result in long-term beneficial impacts on employment. During construction, temporary employment for construction workers would result in a short-term beneficial impact on employment. The no action alternative would not impact taxes and revenue since the MRC is under federal ownership and property taxes are not paid for the site. The implementation of the master plan under the action alternatives would also not provide additional property tax revenue. The increased workforce may add revenue in the form of sales tax from increases in sales at local businesses and retail, resulting in long-term beneficial impacts. Additionally, retail services and businesses may need to increase employment due to the increases in sales. These impacts, through a multiplier effect, would yield additional sales and income tax revenues for Prince George's County and the state of Maryland. The area surrounding the MRC includes a greater percentage of minority populations than that of the state of Maryland and the U.S. The percentage of minority populations is, however, comparable to the rate of the minority population in Prince George's County. Although there are environmental justice populations located near the MRC, equal consideration to concerns and comments on the project has and will continue to be given regardless of age, race, income, or other socioeconomic and demographic factors. There would be no disproportionate adverse impacts to environmental justice communities, including low-income or minority residents, the elderly, or children. In order to determine the impacts of the proposed master plan on air quality, GSA and FDA have conducted an air quality analysis. Under the no action alternative, traffic around the MRC would continue to cause moderate long-term adverse impacts to air quality, and mobile source air emissions would remain at current levels. The MRC is in conformance with the Washington Metropolitan Region State Implementation Plan. Based upon the analysis, it was determined that alternatives A, B, and C would have minor long-term adverse impacts from mobile sources of air pollutants, such as cars and buses. While the amount of additional traffic on local roadways may increase, current U.S. EPA regulations for vehicle engines and fuels would reduce the total amount of emissions by 90%. There would be negligible long-term adverse impacts from stationary sources, such as HVAC systems, and negligible short-term adverse impacts during construction due to fugitive dust and emissions from construction equipment. All action alternatives would conform to the Washington Metropolitan Region State Implementation Plan. In addition, GSA and FDA studied greenhouse gas emissions. Under the no action alternative, the MRC would not add new sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Implementation of alternatives A, B, and C would have minor long-term adverse impacts due to a small increase in stationary and mobile source greenhouse gas emissions that would only be slightly discernible. Negligible short-term direct adverse impacts would occur during construction due to greenhouse gas emissions from construction equipment. With the no action alternative, there would be negligible long-term adverse impacts from general growth in the vicinity of the MRC, which could result in an increase in noise levels. With the action alternatives, increases in noise levels as a result of construction activities would result in minor short-term adverse impacts. Construction activities would be restricted to daytime hours per Prince George's County noise requirements. Newer model construction equipment would be used, and portable noise barriers in construction areas would be established. Long-term increases in traffic would also increase noise levels, resulting in negligible adverse impacts. However, these increases in noise would be barely, if at all, perceptible. A detailed transportation analysis was undertaken to determine the effects on the local transportation network and associated traffic levels. Under the no action alternative, there would be no increase in traffic and there would be no changes in the operation of intersections within the study area. However, existing traffic conditions result in minor long-term adverse impacts. There would be no impacts to public transit, and there would be a negligible long-term adverse impact to bike and pedestrian services, since none currently exist along Muirkirk Road at the MRC. The increase in employees under the action alternatives would have moderate long-term direct adverse impacts to traffic volumes, which would cause additional delays in queuing at multiple intersections. This would require improvements to be made to several of the intersections. There would be negligible long-term adverse impacts to the local transit network. New on-site bicycle and pedestrian facilities that would eventually connect to planned pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure along Muirkirk and Odell roads would result in beneficial impacts to bicyclists and pedestrians. As previously mentioned, a transportation management plan has been prepared to help FDA reduce single occupancy vehicles to and from the campus, provide a carpooling, van pooling program, reduce peak travel times with telecommuting and flexible work schedules, as well as to help FDA reach the required parking maximum of 1 parking space per 2 employees required by NCPC. The draft EIS also looked at utilities, environmental contamination, and waste management. There would be no adverse impacts to utilities under the no action alternative. There would be beneficial impacts from upgrades to existing systems at the MRC, including air handling units, generators, and cooling towers. During construction, there would be negligible short-term adverse impacts due to potential temporary disruptions in utility service. The action alternatives would have negligible long-term adverse impacts to water and sewer due to an increased demand. The existing systems managed by WSSC are able to handle the increased demand. There would also be a negligible long-term adverse impact to electrical service because of an increased demand on the power grid. And there would be an increase in use of natural gas and telecommunication services. The MRC conducts many scientific tests which utilize hazardous materials. Disposal of these materials would continue under the action alternatives, resulting in a minor long-term adverse impact. The environmental contaminants would be disposed of in accordance with state and federal regulations. There would also be beneficial impacts from the replacement of generators, air handling units, and the substation. The no action alternative would have minor short-term adverse impacts from waste generated during construction for new and ongoing projects at the MRC. Over the long term, this impact would continue as the MRC would continue to generate waste. The action alternatives would have a minor short-term adverse impact to waste management due to temporary increases in construction waste and minor long-term adverse impacts to waste management because of the increase in the amount of solid waste, food waste, and recyclables handled at waste receiving facilities. I would like to now turn the presentation back over to Marshall Popkin, and he will discuss the EIS schedule.
That concludes the discussion of the impacts of the proposed master plan. As previously stated, we are in the midst of the 45-day public comment period for the draft EIS, which will end on July 19th. Following that time, GSA and its consultants will prepare the final EIS and issue it for a 30-day review period in late winter, early spring of 2022. Comments received on the draft EIS will be responded to in the final EIS. A final master plan and transportation management plan will be submitted to NCPC for their review and approval at the same time the final EIS is provided for public review. After the final EIS review period, GSA will prepare a record of decision that will document the government's final decision on which alternative they will move forward with. A hard copy of the draft EIS may be obtained for a 24-hour review period at the Laurel Branch Library. The library is located at 507 7th Street in Laurel, Maryland. To obtain a copy of the draft EIS, individuals would need to set up an appointment through the library's website at https://www.pgcmls.info/reopening. GSA requests that all copies of the draft EIS obtained from the Laurel Branch Library be returned within 24 hours. In addition, hard copies of the draft EIS are available for in-person review at the offices of GSA's NEPA consultant, Stantec, located at 6110 Frost Place in Laurel, Maryland. Individuals would need to call the project phone line at 410-777-9537 to request a 1-hour appointment to review the document in person. Appointments are available Monday through Friday between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. Face masks are required for an in-person review. This virtual public hearing provides you with the opportunity to comment on the draft EIS and the Section 106 historic preservation considerations for the MRC Master Plan. The draft EIS and Master Plan are available at the website shown on the next screen, and a hard copy is available for your review by appointment by contacting 410-777-9537. This virtual public hearing provides a venue for raising environmental issues you believe were not addressed or were not adequately addressed in the draft EIS. We want to remind you that comments expressing an opinion about the project itself are not considered a substantive comment relative to potential environmental impacts, and therefore would not be addressed in the final EIS. There are several avenues for you to submit your comments. To provide written comments, you may submit them by email to Mr. Marshall Popkin at the address listed on the screen. Comments may also be mailed to Mr. Popkin, and you can also leave an oral comment on the project phone line at 410-777-9537. All comments on the draft EIS are due to GSA by July 19th. Written comments must be postmarked by July 19th to be accepted. This concludes the virtual public hearing for the draft EIS on the MRC Master Plan. Thank you for your continued interest in the project.